Ashkenazi Jews, also known as Ashkenazic Jews or simply Ashkenazim, are a Jewish diaspora population who coalesced as a distinct community of Jews in the Holy Roman Empire around the end of the first millennium. The traditional diaspora language of Ashkenazi Jews consisted of various dialects of Yiddish. They settled and established communities throughout Central and Eastern Europe, which had been the primary region of concentration and residence from the Middle Ages until recent times, evolving their own distinctive characteristics and diasporic identities. In the late Middle Ages, the center of gravity of the Ashkenazi population shifted steadily eastward, out of the German lands into Poland and Lithuania. In the course of the late 18th and 19th centuries, those Jews who remained in a return to the German lands experienced a cultural reorientation under the influence of the Haskalah and the struggle for emancipation, as well the intellectual and cultural ferment in urban centers. They gradually abandoned the use of Yiddish, while developing new forms of Jewish religious life and cultural identity. Throughout the sojourn in Europe, the Ashkenazim made many important contributions to European culture, and made a quite disproportionate and remarkable contribution to humanity in all fields of endeavor: philosophy, scholarship, literature, art, music and science. The genocidal impact of the Holocaust, the mass murder of approximately 6 million Jews during World War II, devastated the Ashkenazim and the diaspora culture, affecting almost every Jewish family. It is estimated that in the 11th century Ashkenazi Jews composed only 3% of the world's Jewish population, while at the peak in 1931 they accounted for 92% of the world's Jews. Immediately prior to the Holocaust, the number of Jews in the world stood at approximately 16.7 million. Statistical figures vary for the contemporary demography of Ashkenazi Jews, oscillating between 10 million and 11.2 million. Sergio de la Pergola, in a rough calculation of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, implies that Ashkenazi make up less than 74% of Jews worldwide. Other estimates place Ashkenazi Jews as making up about 75% of Jews worldwide. Genetic studies on Ashkenazim, researching both the paternal and maternal lineages, point to a significant prevalence of West Asian origins, but they have arrived at diverging conclusions regarding both the degree and the sources of the European ancestry. These diverging conclusions focus on the extent of the European genetic origin observed in Ashkenazi maternal lineages. Ashkenazi Jews are popularly contrasted with Sephardi Jews, also called Sephardim, who are descendants of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. There are some differences in how the two groups pronounce certain Hebrew letters and in points of ritual etymology. The name Ashkenazi derives from the biblical figure of Ashkenaz, the first son of Gomer, son of Japhet, son of Noah, and a Japhetic patriarch in the Table of Nations. The name of Gomer has often been linked to the ethnonym Sumerians. Biblical Ashkenaz is usually derived from Assyrian Ashkoza, a people who expelled the Sumerians from the Armenian area of the upper Euphrates, whose name is usually associated with the name of the Scythians. The intrusive N in the biblical name is likely due to a scribal error confusing a WAW with a nun. In Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 27, Ashkenaz figures as one of three kingdoms in the far north, the others being Mini and Ararat, perhaps corresponding to Urartu, called on by God to resist Babylon. In the Yoma tractate of the Babylonian Talmud, the name Gomer is rendered as Germania, which elsewhere in rabbinical literature was identified with Germanicia in northwestern Syria, but later became associated with Germania. Ashkenaz is linked to Skansia, viewed as the cradle of Germanic tribes. As early as the 6th century gloss to the Historia Ecclesiastica of Eusebius. In the 10th century history of Armenia of Yohann Drasksanakhtki, Ashkenaz was associated with Armenia, as it was occasionally in Jewish usage, where its denotation extended at times to Adiabene, Khazaria, Crimea and areas to the east. His contemporary Saadia Gaon identified Ashkenaz with the Sakya-Slavic territories, and such usage covered also the lands of tribes neighboring the Slavs, and Eastern and Central Europe. In modern times, Samuel Kraus identified the biblical Ashkenaz with Khazaria. Sometime in the early medieval period, the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe came to be called by this term, in conformity with the custom of designating areas of Jewish settlement with biblical names. Spain was denominated Sephrad, France was called Zarephath, and Bohemia was called the land of Canaan. By the high medieval period, Talmudic commentators like Rashi began to use Ashkenaz, Eretz Ashkenaz, to designate Germany, earlier known as Lota, where, especially in the Rhineland communities of Speyer, Worms and Mainz, the most important Jewish communities arose. Rashi uses Lashon Ashkenaz to describe German speech, and Byzantium and Syrian Jewish letters referred to the Crusaders as Ashkenazim. Given the close links between the Jewish communities of France and Germany following the Carolingian unification, the term Ashkenazi came to refer to both the Jews of medieval Germany and France. History of Jews in Europe before the Ashkenazim. Outside of their origins in ancient Israel, the history of Ashkenazim is shrouded in mystery, and many theories have arisen speculating on their emergence as a distinct community of Jews. The most well-supported theory is the one that details a Jewish migration from Israel through what is now Italy and other parts of southern Europe. The historical record attests to Jewish communities in southern Europe since pre-Christian times. Many Jews were denied full Roman citizenship until 212 CE, when Emperor Caracalla granted all free peoples this privilege. Jews were required to pay a poll tax until the reign of Emperor Julian in 363. In the late Roman Empire, Jews were free to form networks of cultural and religious ties and enter into various local occupations. But, after Christianity became the official religion of Roman Constantinople in 380, Jews were increasingly marginalized. The history of Jews in Greece goes back to at least the archaic era of Greece, when the classical culture of Greece was undergoing a process of formalization after the Greek Dark Age. The Greek historian Herodotus knew of the Jews, whom he called Palestinian Syrians, and listed them among the levied naval forces in service of the invading Persians. While Jewish monotheism was not deeply affected by Greek polytheism, the Greek way of living was attractive for many wealthier Jews. The synagogue in the Agora of Athens is dated to the period between 267 and 396 CE. The Stobi synagogue in Macedonia was built on the ruins of a more ancient synagogue in the 4th century, while later in the 5th century, the synagogue was transformed into Christian basilica. Hellenistic Judaism thrived in Antioch and Alexandria. Many of these Greek-speaking Jews would convert to Christianity. Sporadic epigraphic evidence in gravesite excavations, particularly in Brigasho, Aquincum, Intersiza, Trixene, Savaria, Sopiani in Hungary, and Osijek in Croatia, attest to the presence of Jews after the 2nd and 3rd centuries where Roman garrisons were established. There was a sufficient number of Jews in Pannonia to form communities and build a synagogue. Jewish troops were among the Syrian soldiers transferred there, and replenished from the Middle East, after 175 CE. Jews and especially Syrians came from Antioch, Tarsus and Cappadocia. Others came from Italy and the Hellenized parts of the Roman Empire. The excavations suggest they first lived in isolated enclaves attached to Roman legion camps, and intermarried among other similar Oriental families within the military orders of the region. Raphael Partai states that later Roman writers remarked that they differed little in either customs, manner of writing, or names from the people among whom they dwelt, and it was especially difficult to differentiate Jews from the Syrians. After Pannonia was ceded to the Huns in 433, the garrison populations were withdrawn to Italy, and only a few enigmatic traces remain of a possible Jewish presence in the area some centuries later. No evidence has yet been found of a Jewish presence in antiquity in Germany beyond its Roman border, nor in Eastern Europe, in Gaul and Germany itself, with the possible exception of Trier and Cologne. The archaeological evidence suggests at most a fleeting presence of very few Jews, primarily itinerant traders or artisans. A substantial Jewish population emerged in northern Gaul by the Middle Ages, but Jewish communities existed in 465 CE in Brittany, in 524 CE in Valence, and in 533 CE in Orleans. Throughout this period and into the early Middle Ages, some Jews assimilated into the dominant Greek and Latin cultures, mostly through conversion to Christianity. King Dagobert I of the Franks expelled the Jews from his Merovingian kingdom in 629. Jews in former Roman territories faced new challenges as harsher anti-Jewish church rulings were in force. Charlemagne's expansion of the Frankish Empire around 800, including northern Italy and Rome, brought on a brief period of stability and unity in Francia. This created opportunities for Jewish merchants to settle again north of the Alps. Charlemagne granted the Jews freedoms similar to those once enjoyed under the Roman Empire. In addition, Jews from southern Italy, fleeing religious persecution, began to move into Central Europe. Returning to Frankish lands, many Jewish merchants took up occupations in finance and commerce, including moneylending, or usury. From Charlemagne's time to the present, Jewish life in northern Europe is well documented. By the 11th century, when Rashi of Troyes wrote his commentaries, Jews in what came to be known as Ashkenazim were known for their halakhic learning and Talmudic studies. They were criticized by Sephardim and other Jewish scholars in Islamic lands for the lack of expertise in Jewish jurisprudence and general ignorance of Hebrew linguistics and literature. Yiddish emerged as a result of Judeo-Latin language contact with various High German vernaculars in the medieval period. It is a Germanic language written with Hebrew letters, and heavily influenced by Hebrew and Aramaic, with some elements of Romance and later Slavic languages. High and late Middle Ages migrations. Historical records show evidence of Jewish communities north of the Alps and Pyrenees as early as the 8th and 9th century. By the 11th century, Jewish settlers, moving from southern European and Middle Eastern centers, appear to have begun to settle in the north, especially along the Rhine, often in response to new economic opportunities and at the invitation of local Christian rulers. Thus, Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, invited Jacob ben Yekutiel and his fellow Jews to settle in his lands, and soon after the Norman conquest of England, William the Conqueror likewise extended a welcome to continental Jews to take up residence there. Bishop Rudiger Husman called on the Jews of Mainz to relocate to Speyer. In all of these decisions, the idea that Jews had the know-how and capacity to jump-start the economy, improve revenues, and enlarge trade seems to have played a prominent role. Typically, Jews relocated close to the markets and churches in town centers, where, though they came under the authority of both royal and ecclesiastical powers, they were accorded administrative autonomy. In the 11th century, both Rabbinic Judaism and the culture of the Babylonian Talmud that underlies it became established in southern Italy and then spread north to Ashkenaz. The Jewish communities along the Rhine River from Cologne to Mainz were decimated in the Rhineland massacres of 1096. With the onset of the Crusades, in 1095, and the expulsions from England, France, and parts of Germany, Jewish migration pushed eastward into Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Over this period of several hundred years, some have suggested Jewish economic activity was focused on trade, business management, and financial services due to several presumed factors. Christian European prohibitions restricting certain activities by Jews, preventing certain financial activities between Christians, high rates of literacy, near universal male education, and ability of merchants to rely upon and trust family members living in different regions and countries. By the 15th century, the Ashkenazi Jewish communities in Poland were the largest Jewish communities of the diaspora. This area, which eventually fell under the domination of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, would remain the main center of Ashkenazi Jewry until the Holocaust. The answer to why there was so little assimilation of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe for so long would seem to lie in part in the probability that the alien surroundings in Central and Eastern Europe were not conducive, though contempt did not prevent some assimilation. Furthermore, Jews lived almost exclusively in shtetls, maintained a strong system of education for males, heeded rabbinic leadership, and scorned the lifestyle of the neighbors, and all of these tendencies increased with every outbreak of anti-Semitism. Medieval references in the first half of the 11th century. High-Gaon refers to questions that had been addressed to him from Ashkenaz, by which he undoubtedly means Germany. Rashi in the latter half of the 11th century refers to both the language of Ashkenaz and the country of Ashkenaz. During the 12th century, the word appears quite frequently. In the Mars or Vitry, the kingdom of Ashkenaz is referred to chiefly in regard to the ritual of the synagogue there, but occasionally also with regard to certain other observances. In the literature of the 13th century, references to the land and the language of Ashkenaz often occur. Examples include Solomon ben Adrat's responsa, the responsa of Asher ben Jahiel, his Halakit, the work of his son Jacob ben Asher, Teroric Chaim, the responsa of Isaac ben Sheshe. In the Midrash compilation, Genesis Rabbi Barichia mentions Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah as German tribes or as German lands. It may correspond to a Greek word that may have existed in the Greek dialect of the Jews in Syria Palestina, or the text is corrupted from Germanica. Quote, this view of Barichia is based on the Talmud, where Gomer, the father of Ashkenaz, is translated by Germania, which evidently stands for Germany, and which was suggested by the similarity of the sound. In later times, the word Ashkenaz is used to designate southern and western Germany, the ritual of which sections differs somewhat from that of eastern Germany and Poland. Thus the prayer book of Isaiah Horowitz, and many others, give the piyutim according to the minhag of Ashkenaz and Poland. According to 16th-century mystic Rabbi Elijah of Chelm, Ashkenazi Jews lived in Jerusalem during the 11th century. The story is told that a German-speaking Jew saved the life of a young German man surnamed Doelberger. So when the Knights of the First Crusade came to siege Jerusalem, one of Doelberger's family members, who was among them, rescued Jews in Palestine and carried them back to Worms to repay the favor. Further evidence of German communities in the Holy City comes in the form of halakhic questions sent from Germany to Jerusalem during the second half of the 11th century. Modern history. Material relating to the history of German Jews has been preserved in the communal accounts of certain communities on the Rhine, a Memorbuch, and a Liebesbrief, documents that are now part of the Sassoon collection. Heinrich Graetz has also added to the history of German Jewry in modern times in the abstract of his seminal work, History of the Jews, which he entitled Volksthümliche Geschichte der Juden. In an essay on Sephardi Jewry, Daniel Elazar at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs summarized the demographic history of Ashkenazi Jews in the last 1,000 years, noting that at the end of the 11th century, 97% of world Jewry was Sephardic and 3% Ashkenazi. By the end of 16th century, the Treaty on the Redemption of Captives by Gratian of the God's Mother, Mercy priests, who was imprisoned by Turks, cites a Tunisian Hebrew, made captive when arriving to Gaeta, who aided others with money, named Simon Ashkenazi. In the mid-17th century, Sephardim still outnumbered Ashkenazim 3-2, but by the end of the 18th century, Ashkenazim outnumbered Sephardim 3-2, the result of improved living conditions in Christian Europe versus the Ottoman Muslim world. By 1931, Ashkenazi Jews accounted for nearly 92% of world Jewry. These factors are shared demography showing the migration patterns of Jews from southern and western Europe to Central and Eastern Europe. In 1740, a family from Lithuania became the first Ashkenazi Jews to settle in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. In the generations after emigration from the West, Jewish communities in places like Poland, Russia, and Belarus enjoyed a comparatively stable socio-political environment, a thriving publishing industry, and the printing of hundreds of biblical commentaries precipitated the development of the Hasidic movement as well as major Jewish academic centers. After 2 centuries of comparative tolerance in the new nations, massive westward emigration occurred in the 19th and 20th centuries in response to pogroms in the East and the economic opportunities offered in other parts of the world. Ashkenazi Jews have made up the majority of the American Jewish community since 1750. In the context of the European Enlightenment, Jewish emancipation began in 18th-century France and spread throughout Western and Central Europe. Disabilities that had limited the rights of Jews since the Middle Ages were abolished, including the requirements to wear distinctive clothing, pay special taxes, and live in ghettos isolated from non-Jewish communities, and the prohibitions on certain professions. Laws were passed to integrate Jews into the host countries, forcing Ashkenazi Jews to adopt family names. Newfound inclusion into public life led to cultural growth in the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, with its goal of integrating modern European values into Jewish life. As a reaction to increasing anti-Semitism and assimilation following the emancipation, Zionism was developed in Central Europe. Other Jews, particularly those in the Pale of Settlement, turned to socialism. These tendencies would be united in Labor Zionism, the founding ideology of the State of Israel. The Holocaust. Of the estimated 8.8 million Jews living in Europe at the beginning of World War II, the majority of whom were Ashkenazi, about 6 million, more than 2/3, were systematically murdered in the Holocaust. These included 3 million of 3.3 million Polish Jews, 900,000 of 1.5 million in Ukraine, and 50 to 90% of the Jews of other Slavic nations. Germany, Hungary, and the Baltic states, and over 25% of the Jews in France. Sephardi communities suffered similar depletions in a few countries, including Greece, the Netherlands, and the former Yugoslavia. As the large majority of the victims were Ashkenazi Jews, the percentage dropped from nearly 92% of world Jewry in 1931 to nearly 80% of world Jewry today. The Holocaust also effectively put an end to the dynamic development of the Yiddish language in the previous decades, as the vast majority of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, around 5 million, were Yiddish speakers. Many of the surviving Ashkenazi Jews emigrated to countries such as Israel, Canada, Argentina, Australia, and the United States after the war. Following the Holocaust, some sources place Ashkenazim today as making up approximately 83 to 85% of Jews worldwide, while Sergio de la Pergola, in a rough calculation of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, implies that Ashkenazi make up a notably lower figure, less than 74%. Other estimates place Ashkenazi Jews as making up about 75% of Jews worldwide. Ashkenazi Jews constitute around 35 to 36% of Israel's total population, or 47.5% of Israel's Jewish population. In Israel, the term Ashkenazi is now used in a manner unrelated to its original meaning, often applied to all Jews who settled in Europe and sometimes including those whose ethnic background is actually Sephardic. Jews of any non-Ashkenazi background, including Mizrahi, Yemenite, Kurdish and others who have no connection with the Iberian Peninsula, have similarly come to be lumped together as Sephardic. Jews of mixed background are increasingly common, partly because of intermarriage between Ashkenazi and non-Ashkenazi, and partly because many do not see such historic markers as relevant to the life experiences as Jews. Religious Ashkenazi Jews living in Israel are obliged to follow the authority of the chief Ashkenazi rabbi in halakhic matters. In this respect, a religiously Ashkenazi Jew is an Israeli who is more likely to support certain religious interests in Israel, including certain political parties. These political parties result from the fact that a portion of the Israeli electorate votes for Jewish religious parties, although the electoral map changes from one election to another. There are generally several small parties associated with the interests of religious Ashkenazi Jews. The role of religious parties, including small religious parties that play important roles as coalition members, results in turn from Israelis' composition as a complex society in which competing social, economic, and religious interests stand for election to the Knesset, a unicameral legislature with 120 seats. People of Ashkenazi descent constitute around 47.5% of Israeli Jews. They have played a prominent role in the economy, media, and politics of Israel since its founding. During the first decades of Israel as a state, strong cultural conflict occurred between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. The roots of this conflict, which still exists to a much smaller extent in present-day Israeli society, are chiefly attributed to the concept of the melting pot. That is to say, all Jewish immigrants who arrived in Israel were strongly encouraged to melt down their own particular exilic identities within the general social pot in order to become Israeli. The Ashkenazi chief rabbis in the Yishuv and Israel include Abraham Isaac Kook, Isaac Halevi Herzog, Issa Yehuda Unterman, Shlomo Goren, Avraham Shapira, Israel Meerlau, Shear Yashav Cohen, Yonah Metzger, David Lau,